Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello and welcome back to the show. Growing up, it was always instilled in me that entertainment served no function. As such, the bulk of my childhood was kept hidden from entertainment. Television channels were locked behind a six-figure digital pin. Trips to the movie theater were once every few years, and video arcade games were an untouchable object of desire. And for a while, I adopted this philosophy as well, relegating entertainment to the bottom of my priorities list. But as I gained more autonomy, I gradually rediscovered entertainment as an outlet for stress relief and found that they offered a slew of opportunities for widening of perspectives, valuable life lessons, and so much more. All that to say, entertainment can serve as far more than pure mindless amusement, although it's equally valid to utilize it as such. And it seems like these sentiments have some merit to it. So in this episode, we're exploring the correlation between well-being and entertainment. And to guide us through this is applied micro-econometric researcher Silvia Salazar, specializing in development economics, gender and ethnic inequality, as well as public policy. Silvia has presented her research at numerous international conferences and workshops. So we're incredibly fortunate to have her here with us on the show today. Welcome, Silvia.
Hi, Marie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for sitting through my extra long intro. So before we begin, how would you describe your role as an applied micro-econometric researcher?
Yeah, I know that sounds complicated when you say it like this. What it actually means is that I'm an economist. I do research in economics, but I do research mostly on empirical work. So I work on data and surveys, and I don't focus so much on the theory behind it, like a little bit, but it's not my area of expertise, let's say. So I guess contrary to what people think, like economists, we think that we only care about inflation and GDP and interest rates, but that's actually not true. It's just actually a very small part of economics. What I do is microeconomics, and that's kind of the study of the small economic units, like individuals, consumers, and families. And what I'm actually concerned about is how they make decisions in an economic framework. So, for instance, you can think of if you have a child, right? So if you have a child, you decide, okay, we might like to take him to childcare or not, or if I'm going to stop working or not, or all of these economic decisions that you're taking, how are you taking them, right? Who decided who steps out of work and who stays in? And then we do that in an economic framework. So let's say if you're thinking about children's education, for instance, you might think, okay, I want to spend more money on the education of my child or less money and invest more time, right? So instead of thinking of families are, like a mother and a father and a child, you're thinking about economics. So you're thinking about a small business. So a family is really a small business in which they produce goods, and those goods can be things like education or entertainment or many other things. And in this case, for education, you are always using inputs, but in this case will be things like money and time. And the price of those goods depends on different things, how much you value the education of your child or how do you not. So personally, what I'm really concerned about is time and how this time influences the decisions that you take in your household, and treating time really as a scarce resource, because time is so precious to us, but it seems that in economics doesn't really exist. So that's what I do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what do you think is the benefit of looking at, let's say, families and individuals and how we produce or how we make decisions through an economics lens?
I think it makes you, I guess, put a different perspective on things, right? So you're thinking about, you're not looking at sort of the holistic aspect of somehow the cultural aspect where you're thinking it's about, okay, you're an individual, you're taking rational decisions, and this is how you're taking it. And this allows you to have a framework that you can actually test, because it's really hard to think about all the sociology decisions that you take without really thinking, how are you going to test if these are true or not? But putting in an economic framework allows you to test all these hypotheses in a very robust way, let's say. So that's what data allow us to do. It allows us to test whether those hypotheses are true or not. And that's, I think, the benefits of economics is that it really tries to create this causal link with a lot of data and econometrics and fancy, let's say fancy statistical techniques. But it allows you to have this robust test and test things that you don't think you can test, like, is my child better off going into a private school or not? Or I am better off stopping to work or not? Or all these sorts of decisions that you never thought you could actually empirically test them.
Right. And I think that's quite a general conception that economics is mostly quantitative, but as a microeconometric, oh my gosh, I'm still not super familiar with the term.
You can just say econometrician as a microeconomist. Yeah.
But yeah, as someone in that field, how accurate would you say that is?
I think, economics right now, I think economic is wide and there is a lot of people that do heterodox economics and so forth. But I think right now, economics is very a quantitative field. I guess maybe even more so in microeconomics, because it's a very defined economic framework and is full of equations and statistical tools that you can use to actually create that causality. And in order to do that, you need to have very strong quantitative methods. And even though there are some people who do qualitative work in economics, that's very rare. I mean, nowadays, let's say, is really depending on, do I have the data? Is this data good? What can I extract from this data?
Right. And that's probably why it works so well for some people, because it's, well, there is not just numbers everywhere. I mean, like there is reasoning behind the numbers. And anyway, I'm getting too far in the detail, but the numbers are essentially, the numbers are the same no matter what the language is. And I guess it could be different, but largely the same, I guess. It's a very sweeping statement, but anyway, that's a great preface for our topic for today. But before we go further into detail, I would love to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Silvia? And my first question for you is, what is your favorite book?
This is always a hard one to answer because there are so many good books and you don't want to leave anything behind. But I guess I was thinking maybe a book that gave me the envy to do something. And I think one of those books to me was a book that it was called Born to Run by Christopher McDougall. So I don't know if you know this book, but this book is really about a race between ultra marathon runners and runners from this Mexican tribe called the Tarahumara. And they traditionally run to go everywhere. So they run to go really far distances, and that's how their everyday life is. They always running really long distance. And this book is really about this race, about having proper, let's say, ultramarathon runners rather than these traditional runners that basically they just do that every day as a way of living. And I thought it was a really interesting book because it's also about the science of running and about our intrinsic capacity to run. And it's interesting because running long distances is very humbling in the sense that there is almost no difference whether you look at age or gender or anything. Like in the long run, in these really long marathons, or there is really no much that makes a difference. And I think that's kind of really interesting, having this sort of level field that is level for everybody, and how you have this intrinsic capacity to run, but you really don't use it. And it definitely motivated me, at least for a little bit, to run quite a lot. I didn't manage to keep up, but it was really interesting experience anyways.
Yeah. So how long did you manage to keep the running for?
To be honest, I think I probably did quite well during 2 years. And afterwards, I still love running, but it's not as, I don't run 20Ks every week anymore. So, yeah.
Look, I reckon keeping up running for 2 years is still quite an impressive feat. So I would just pat myself on the back and move on to the next thing. So aside from books, what movies have you enjoyed recently?
Actually, the last film that actually is sticking to my mind was a film that is called Full Time. It's a French movie by Eric Gravel, and it's about. As a French movie, as like many French movies, not much really happens in the movie, but it's about this woman that is always trying to. So she lives in the outskirts of Paris, and she works downtown Paris. So she has to take like this really long train ride to get into her work, and there is strikes all the time in this metro. She's always late. She's always trying to like run against time. And I guess because I actually love time, this movie felt like, even if much didn't happen, it just felt like you were on her shoes, just running, trying to get some time. And I just felt like it just sticks with you. At the end of the movie, of course, I won't tell you the end, but, you just have this feeling of, wow, some people just have this life where they just decided, I want to have a quality of life, but I can only do it if I work 2 hours away from where I live. And, that's their choice they make. And then, they just run for time all the time. So it's just an interesting thing, especially for me as a researcher in time economics.
Yeah, that's a really interesting premise, and it definitely resonates with me sometimes. We have considerably good public transport here, but sometimes there are protests in the CBD, and the public transport system is designed in a way where it's all connected. You have to go into the CBD to get to the other side of the city. So a lot of the time on the weekends, it's just getting delayed by the protests. So but that's probably, what the main character or protagonist is going through in that movie is probably way more extreme than what I have to face on a weekly basis. But thank you for sharing that. Now, apart from that, are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
I kind of every day. I did my university in France, so I watch a lot of French things in general. So I guess that's kind of one of the things to say. But there is this kind of French podcast that I often listen to it almost every day, that is called The Feet on the Ground, and it's really a short and a slightly different French version of This American Life. I'm not sure if you know about this podcast, but I think it's quite a well-known podcast, and it's really about stories of random people that have random things to happen to them, and they don't have to be big things. It can be something really simple and not very strange or anything, but it's just the fact that it's just anybody could be there, because we all have these sort of stories that could be big or small, but they always teach you something somehow. So I always find that sort of topic interesting in the podcast. I guess lately I've also been listening to this podcast that is called The Good Whale by Serial Production and the New York Times, and it's the story about the Free Willy whale, and basically how after this movie was filmed, there was a big backlash because this whale was in awful captivity enclosures and so forth, and so they did actually decide to free this whale, that is to actually free Willy. So the podcast is really the story about how they managed to do that. So I thought it was quite interesting and quite different from other things that I actually hear in podcasts, really.
Yeah, for sure. And what do you say you like about these two podcasts?
I guess I think the goal for me of a podcast is to just take the mind a little bit off whatever I'm doing. I usually can't work with no sound at all. I need to have a background sound. And I like to listen to podcasts that, like kind of, make me think about small things in life, but that has big repercussions and that's what I like about this podcast, right? How little things, or somebody decided, okay, I'm going to free a whale that has always been in captivity, or things like that, and how you manage to do these sort of things. I guess for me, it's more about the entertaining side. Like, I do listen to podcasts that are more about learning things and so forth. But I guess to me, especially what I'm doing, usually I'm coding. I just want to take my mind out of things, and those sort of podcasts help me do that.
Yeah, 100%. And it's always nice when, you listen to a podcast that inspires you to learn a bit more about the topic, but at your own pace as well. You don't have to read up right away. You can be intrigued or just casually curious. And, at some point you can do a little bit more reading afterwards. It's entertaining, but also fulfilling at the same time. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. My next question for you is who do you look up to, either in your professional life or your personal life?
I think I really find it kind of hard to answer this question, because I feel like, I don't know, I feel like having a role model is a bit kind of, not a snob, but yeah, it's a bit odd to think, okay, I look up after this person, like, it's a bit odd. I think I like things about multiple persons. I don't think I necessarily have someone that I actually think of, this is the person I would like to become, or so forth. I just guess my mother, in a way, I think she works, she worked quite a bit and quite successfully, even in the time when women weren't really supposed to work. And so I guess that definitely inspired me into my career, and many other things, like probably going far. But I guess women are often an inspiration for me, especially those early barrier breakers, those women that decided, I'm going to run a marathon, even if you don't let me, or I'm going to surf. I surf a little bit, not a lot. I'm really bad at it. But, like, you can see all these women that are surfing these waves that are gigantic and has no fear. I think all these people kind of inspire me to, okay, like, they can do that. You can do something that is just seems like simpler, and, and you are not breaking any barriers. So just kind of following on the steps of those women that are just doing these crazy things that, that are actually breaking the barrier for us. So I guess probably more.
Yeah, that's so fair. But yeah, what I'm hearing is that you look up to people who display courage and braveness. But what are some other traits that you find to be particularly admirable?
I guess I always admire people that have discipline, mostly because I have none. And I think that's, if I had discipline, I could definitely go farther or do other things much faster, or, so I think, like, discipline and people that manage to get discipline on themselves, I found them quite admirable, to be honest, in general. Whether, it's a important person, but even just, like, just my colleagues and so forth, like, I always admire that sort of trait of just having the discipline to do things. I think, yeah, that's definitely builds characters and perseverance, and I think it's probably a trait that you would like to have in the future, like, because I think it's linked with very good outcomes, especially professionally. But yeah, I guess that's something I admire. I think I also admire people that manage to have really good work-life balance. I think there it's in academia, especially, you work like a crazy person, and it's hard to say, okay, I have the time to do this, or, I won't feel guilty about it. And I think these people that manage to say, this is my work-life balance and this is how I do it, I also very kind of admirative of them, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. But as a researcher, I imagine that you must have some discipline.
You would think so. I guess I do to some extent, but just probably it's not. I wouldn't define myself as somebody with a lot of discipline, right? I would say that despite of my lack of discipline, I managed to do a lot of things. But I mean, I can see how people that have discipline, wake up in the morning, do this, and you just kind of rule, and this is how they manage to get all these things done. I think I have more of a dispersed mind in which, I just look at things here and there. And I guess that's probably why I love mathematics as well, right? It's probably that kind of abstract context that I also like. So I guess that also makes me a good researcher. But yeah, I think having a little bit of discipline, more discipline, let's say, it will definitely be better for me.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, my last question for you is there a class or course that you've taken in your lifetime that has stuck with you to this date?
I think, I mean, it will seem a bit redundant, but I guess, so I'm a researcher, so that's what I do for life. And most of this came out of a course that I took in my master's degree university that is called Development Economics. And it's actually a course, it was an applied course about basically, I guess mostly microeconomics, but it was about, so you see how, as I said, like people think like economists are people that work in the Fed or, in the Reserve Bank, or people that work in companies or banks. And that's like maybe people that work in the Fed of the RBA are actually people that are economists, but most of the time we are very not like business oriented, or like we don't work in banks or things like that. So, and economics is like such a wide science. People think it's just about all this macro and inflation and GDP and so forth. And to be honest, I just couldn't care less about these sort of things. To me, economics, and this course was about all these other things that are economics, but you don't think are economics, like civil wars. Would you ever think that a civil war is an economic thing? But it is. It's actually the most important thing that defines a civil war is the economics behind it. Things like health, like will that health be an economic issue? But yeah, it is all these things that, like measuring health outcomes and so forth. If you put everything in this economic framework, can have such a different things, culture as well. You can have these cultural things that are different from one another's, and when you're exploring that into an economic angle is also quite different. Like even family economics, environmental economics, they're just everything that you can drive into this economic angle. And I think that course was about that. It's about all these things that you can do in economics that you think are not, but you can, every single thing that you're thinking of. Like I do research in gender as well. And I think I like surfing. So I do like research on gender and surfing, like in economics. So, like every single thing that you can think of, you can actually bring it to this economic framework. And I really like that course because it really opened my mind about, if I do research in economics, I could just work about anything really. And if I get bored about a subject, I could just change and do something else. So I really, I guess, appreciated that course because of that. And that's why I decided to go into this PhD in economics and development economics and kind of tilt to this area of research.
You're really selling it very well, because now I am interested in economics. And before, well, let's just say I wasn't. But that was a great segue to our interview as well. So thank you very much for sharing more about yourself. Very much appreciate it. My first question for you is, how would you define affluence?
So I guess affluence to me, or let's say in economics, is really referred to a person that have a great deal of money or material possessions. I guess to me, it's also someone who has a great deal of time, because to me, time is precious. So someone that has a lot of time is somebody that does not suffer from being time poor, and also there is some wealth on it, to be honest. That's kind of how I see affluence. And of course, affluence has often been associated with higher levels of well-being. Like people think like if you are wealthier, then you are happier and you have other life satisfactions and things like that. So I think that's how I see affluence. Also, I think now, due to environmental concerns, affluence has also had a bad connotation. And people really think about how consuming more actually puts higher pressure on our resources. So I think now you have this conception about affluence being something that people have a lot of money and material possessions, but it's also a bad thing because this is not necessarily good for our environment.
Mm-hmm. And what is your definition of entertainment?
So entertainment to me is really the colloquial word that people use to describe all expenses that are not really essential or that we don't consider as essential. And that's what we call in the economic jargon discretionary expenditures, really. And they are those expenses that you really don't need to live. You don't really need to live. Such as like food and housing and transportation. Those things are essential. You definitely need to eat, you need a house, and you probably need a transportation as well. However, of course, this definition has changed over time because things that 20 years ago may not seem essential, now they are. Like if you're thinking about someone without internet, that will be like really complicated to live if you don't have internet. Or even a cell phone plan, it will be extremely complicated for you to go by in your life without those. So these some sort of things actually now become more like essential expenditure and not so much as like a luxury good. So entertainment expenses to me are those goods that are really considered are luxuries or leisure goods, let's say. And you don't really need them, but it's nice to have them, right? And those things are like sports entertainment. So if you want to go and watch a match, or if you want to go to the movies or the theater, or you want to go to a restaurant and things like that. So this is, to me, kind of the definition of entertainment.
Yeah. And what would you say is the relationship between affluence or income levels and entertainment spending patterns? Is this something that you explore in your research?
Yeah, I think there is quite a bit of research about that. I think the richer you are, definitely the more you spend in entertainment. And this is not only in absolute terms, but especially as a share of your income. So the important thing for us when we're really measuring entertainment expenses and your wealth is really we look at what is the share of your income that you allocate to entertainment expenses, right? The more you spend of the share, the larger the share that your income you spend in entertainment expenses, the wealthier you are. And this is actually a common way where people measure poverty in economics. So a way of knowing whether a country or different families have a low income level is you look at the expenses that they have into education, into food or essential goods. So for instance, you can have a look at what is the share of their income that is allocated to food or essential expenditures. And for instance, in developing countries, you can see that the average of low and poor in countries, I said not development, probably low income countries, this percentage is as high as 70 or 90%. So almost all your budget is going into those essential expenditures. But in developed economies, this is more like 20 or 30%. And the more you spend on other things, like entertainment, so then the wealthier you are. So it's also a measure for us to look at how wealthy you are, depending on how you spend your money, basically.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I always, this is not so much related to entertainment expenses per se, but more in general. A lot of people say that a good rule of thumb for saving money is to put in 30% of your income to rent. So anything higher than that is too much. But especially with geographically, this is going to be different depending on where you're located and also what you do. That's just very it's just very, very general, is what I always thought. So what is what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the rule of thumb you're saying. Like, yeah, everybody say, okay, you have a good balance in terms of your budget if you actually allocate 30% of your budget into housing. I think it's easy to say. I think in average, that's true because we have the older generation that have already accumulated their housing wealth and so forth, and the people that bought when, prices weren't so high. But if you're renting right now, I mean, sometimes you can't really afford of going under 50% of your budget on housing. And this is something that we see, especially in low-income households, where the amount of money that are even younger generation, the amount of money that you spend in housing is way higher. And this is not only in places like Australia, where we know there is a scarcity of let's say, housing, but in other places as well. So in Europe is the same. And, people don't always have the luxury of saying, I can only pay 30% of my budget, because if 30% of your budget doesn't get your house, well, you have to do something. So I think people, what they do is that they actually decide to pay, okay, this is the amount of money that we're spending housing, and then everything else just kind of varies accordingly. Because this is a big expenses. And I think food is easier, I guess, not easier, but it's easier to substitute like cheaper food by more expensive food. But I think housing, at a point, if you cannot get any lower. So, and especially sometimes you might like to have a better lifestyle. So you might not want to live 3 hours from the CBD. So you decide, I will stay on the CBD because I enjoy being around restaurants and places that are nice and that I can walk to. And this is the quality of life that I want. And I think it's valid to have that point of view. I think for sure in my life, I had more than 30% for a really long time, my spending on housing. And it's just the way it is. And I think for the younger generation, things are more difficult. And it's not easy to find that 30% balance where you're looking at.
Yeah, 100%. And what would you say is the importance of setting aside some expenses for entertainment?
So I guess first you have to be able to do it. Not everybody has the luxury to set aside income for entertainment. And I think now with this cost of living crisis a little bit everywhere worldwide, people might not be able to do it. But of course, if you manage to get some money aside, we know that in general, spending more money on entertainment actually increases your level of well-being. But that having been said, I think leisure activities in general increase your well-being. And some of those activities, you might need to pay for it. So you might need to pay to go to see the movies, but you might also not need to pay to go to the beach. And those activities where you substitute to one another, you actually have the same level of well-being. So it actually depends as well on your preference. If you are a person that likes to go to the movies all the time and you have no money, then it's harder for you to reach that level of satisfaction. But if you are somebody that is happy just going to the beach every day and not spending any money on anything else, then, it really depends a lot on people's preference as well. But in general, we can say that definitely having at least the possibility or going out or going to the movies is actually what makes them different into people's well-being. Just having the possibility, even if you don't necessarily do it.
Right. And in the research or in studies that have been done, how are the well-being benefits of entertainment or leisure activities being measured?
So theoretically, what we do is that we quantify well-being in consumption by saying, okay, each person has a level of satisfaction, or let's say a level of happiness. That in economics, we call that a level of utility, right? And that level of utility is directly related to the consumption of goods and services that you have, but also of things like leisure, right? So you have this model in which a person tries to maximize or to have the maximum level of happiness by increasing their consumption and the time that they spend on leisures. And in theoretical models, the more you spend, that's the higher your level of satisfaction, right? However, as I said, when we talk to entertainment, we also have to make a distinction between those monetary expenditures and on-time expenses, because it's not necessarily because you're spending more money that you are increasing your level of satisfaction. If you feel like, you can get out of without having to spend the money, getting something as well in return. So it's not necessarily the way it works. So it's not directly related, but most of the time it is. And I guess the way we measure that is that when we look at things like money, so money is easier to quantify, right? Because then you say if you spend X amount of money in going to the movies, that is how you're treating that sort of good, and how you quantify the share of your income, of the share of your consumption that goes into entertainment. But when you look at time, things are different, because how do you include time into those things, right? How much an hour of your time is worth? And that's kind of the research that I do. And I look at, okay, how are you going to deal with that? Then you have to monetize time, right? But not all time is the same. If I tell you that you can never see your kid, but you have an hour where you can see your kid per year, but you can, instead of seeing your kid, I will pay you $50,000 not to see your kid. But this is the only time that you have to see your kid. You might not take that $50,000 because that time is not worth it. So the way you price time is really endogenous to everybody, because sometimes have more value to you than others. Some people might get a lot of utility out of work. So it means a lot of satisfaction out of going to work. But some people think, okay, this is useless. I'm not going to work if I don't have to. So how do you actually monetize that time? How is that leisure important to you relative to something else? So that's when things get tricky, and you have a look at different ways of kind of valuing time. You can look at time as an opportunity cost, so which is like the time that it will cost you instead of going to work, but it also be like that replacement cost. For instance, instead of you cleaning the house, you're paying somebody else to clean the house. So how much is that time worth? So it's kind of different strategies. And I mean, that's why I guess it's interesting and I do it.
Yeah, there's so much thought that goes into it. But apart from that, how do economic factors like inflation or interest rates or anything like that, how do they affect entertainment spending?
So inflation and interest rate, they have really a mechanism that goes through the price of goods. So they both increase the price of goods and services. That means that given if your income does not change, buying the same basket of goods will become more expensive, right? And what people do when that happens is that they do two things. So first, they substitute the consumption that they have. So for instance, instead of going to the movies on a Saturday, they might go to the movies on a Tuesday when it's cheaper. So there is a substitution of consumption. That's what we call the substitution effect. But if that inflation or the increase of prices is too high, people will have to start cutting in their entertainment expenses overall. And this is what you call the income effect. So you will reduce the amount of money that you spend into income. And this and what is important to point out is that this inflation doesn't have to come directly into the price of entertainment. So let's say the price of entertainment and going to the movies remains the same, but the price of petrol really goes up, or the price of food really goes up. Because those are essential expenditures, you will always cut first on these entertainment expenses, because those are the ones that you can spare to live without. So even if you don't have a direct effect or a direct price effect of the entertainment due to inflation, this sort of cross price effects had actually quite a big influence in entertainment. So entertainment is always the first thing that will suffer, because it's the thing that you can spare not to do.
Right. And so from what you know, how do entertainment industries respond to economic downturns?
So the way this happens usually is that when you have an economic downturn, so one thing can happen, you can actually lose your job. And in that case, of course, there is a direct impact because you lose your job and then you have to cut on expenses of a lot of things. But it also can happen that you are in the same position that you were before. But when a crisis arrives, people usually tend to accumulate what we call precautionary savings. You start saving even though nothing has happened to you, because you are afraid that something may happen. So instead of spending the money that you will be in entertainment, you will just save that money and just make sure that it's in reserve in case you need something. So for instance, we look at Australia, and the beginning of the pandemic, let's say December 2019, we have the savings rates that were around like 7%. And then COVID arrived. And then what happened was that 6 months afterwards, in June 2020, the savings ratio actually increased to 24%. Even though like Australia almost didn't suffer from that pandemic because the economic environment actually managed to function quite well. But people are just scared, so they actually just cut on these entertainment expenses and they just save a lot. And that's what happens in economic downturns usually. So again, these entertainment expenses are the ones that suffer the most, because if you want to save, you are just going to cut into those expenses that are not necessary.
Yeah. And how has technology transformed entertainment consumption patterns?
Well, I guess first, I think it has changed the definition that we have of entertainment, right? As I said, something that wasn't essential before. So you will think like 20 years ago, if I tell you expenses that you do on internet, you will tell me, okay, that's a luxury, or that is an entertainment expenses. But nowadays, if you tell me that you can have internet, this is not something that you will do. This is for you, it's become an essential good. So I think technology has first modified the definition that we have of entertaining goods, what we deem that is essential and what we deem that is not. So these things are now incorporated for us. You will always want to have internet and you always want to have a cell phone plan, because otherwise it's really hard to move around. But it also depends on the type of consumption that you're talking about. So of course, technology has arrived and has changed many things, like the way you purchase tickets and so forth. But in many instances, it hasn't really changed much. Going to a sports event, going to a theater, to a festival, or to a concert hasn't really changed much now than it had 20 years ago, apart from the fact that you are probably buying your ticket online. But in other areas, of course, like televisions or movies, new technologies have definitely created a lot of substitutions in consumptions that you can have. So you can now, instead of going to the movies, you still have all these movies in this streaming service. So why would you bother to go to a theater whether you can just access all these movies just within the minute? So it has definitely changed the way people have substituted the way that they consume these sort of things. But it also has made it more affordable for people to be able to see all these movies that you weren't, like, how many times will you watch? I don't know, 100 movies a year. Like, this is something that you never did. And now it's like something that you just do every time because you just kind of stream it, right? So it has actually given a lot of affordability and allow people to access this good that probably they didn't did before. So I guess there is these two different aspects of technology and entertainment.
Yeah, and with the subscription model that all the streaming platforms are adopting as well, and yeah, with the affordability of it at the moment, it has sort of turned into more of an essential for middle income people, I think, where it's affordable enough to where you wouldn't necessarily strike it off as the first thing to go when you're in hard times, because it's not that much money, but it also gives you a good amount of fulfillment, because there's a whole slew of TV programs and movies that you can pick from as well. And to add on to that, the family plans that they have now on, for example, like Spotify or Netflix, make it a lot harder to cancel. But yeah, is there a term for this sort of phenomenon in economics?
I think this is more like a market thing. I think streaming services, for sure, they as any other companies, they just want you to stay and stick with them. Streaming services is actually a very competitive field right now. So there is a lot of different streaming services and people have to pick which services they are. Some people have 5 different services where they allow, and as you say, it's because it has become more affordable. It's cheaper for you to have a subscription for a month than going to the movies. So why would you just go into the movie instead of just having access to all these things that you can do it anytime? So I think, yeah, there is definitely this sort of substitution effect that is playing there. And I think, yeah, as any other companies, they want to make you stay in. I think streaming services is probably not the worst. I think there are some other companies that probably want you to stay in and manage to tie you in more, like, I don't know, gyms and so forth, where you have these really long-term subscriptions. I think the way most of these companies, the streaming companies, work is they just want to give you a taste of whatever you have. And in all these families have their own accounts. Of course, it's harder to cancel, but it's very easy if you want to do so as well. It's just more about how they hook you into staying. And I think that's probably the marketing strategy that they're after. And I mean, that's probably any other companies do the same thing.
Yeah, 100%. So overall, from what you know, what are the emerging trends in entertainment consumption, and how do you think they'll shape the future of our spending patterns?
So I think it's a hard question for me to answer, mostly because I always concentrate on the past and what happened here, that I really don't care that much about the future. But I think definitely AI will make a big difference in this industry, because it will cause a lot of disruption. If you're really thinking about it, you can have movies that are entirely written by AI, right? And this will cause definitely a big disruption in the industries. And then there are things that I think probably have a kind of an interesting application, like augmented reality. I think the way we watch movies or we do video gaming and so forth will actually change quite a bit because of that. That is because, maybe there is a way where we can think about watching a movie in a more immersed way than we used to. And I think as that technology gets cheaper and is more affordable to do it, I think this is something that will probably spread in the future. And yeah, I guess there is other things that might be interesting. I think the traditional financial methods of entertainment and raising funding for entertainment will probably change as well. I think this large company that used to pick a singer or a movie or a writer will struggle probably more in the future, because I think with all these new sort of crowdfundings and people just managing to come out of, just putting their videos online and so forth, I think that will bring some sort of diversity as well. So I think the financial side will definitely be an important one in this entertainment area in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Now let's move on to the practices and habits section. My first question for you is, what habit would you recommend practicing with regards to entertainment?
I guess personally, I would say try to find a cheap habit. I think there is a lot that you can get out of, like doing free things. And because there is so many things that cities are putting in place and so forth that you can't really get away with, just not spending a lot of money on. If you can get a lot of rewards out of going to the beach or going to the river, or, of course, not everybody has a beach or a river to go to. Next door, of course, this is an Australia kind of case. So, but if you can do these sort of things, that basically that you don't need to feel like you're getting something out of spending money, it's always a good habit, because it actually will influence your well-being in the future. If you're always thinking about the money and the money that you could be spending more if I had a jet or if I had something. So I think the aspirational of your expenditure is actually very detrimental to your well-being. Sometimes we just say, like, being happy where you are is quite important. And I think manage to just live within your means and saying, okay, I like this, I enjoy this, but not thinking about what you don't have or what you could have in entertainment if you had this money and so forth. I think that's kind of very important for well-being. And this is something that expectations have a very, very important impact into your well-being. And as I said, if you can manage to have some entertainment expenditures in which you say, okay, I don't need that much money to do that and so forth, these are the one that will fulfill you, that's definitely a better thing to have.
Yeah, 100%. I personally have found a lot of fulfillment in just going on these random deep dives. Like maybe I'll see something that piques my curiosity a little bit and I'll just search it up on Google and see what comes up and just read all these articles about this one particular topic. And it sounds very boring. I'm just realizing as I'm saying it out loud, it's just searching things on Google and reading it. But the amount of things you can learn that are oddly specific and very niche, it can be surprising, and it also makes for great conversation starter. Like wherever you go, just like whip out that fun fact that you just learned about. You know, killing two birds in one stone, you see.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's completely free. I mean, it's not technically free if you were to like break it up into like how much but you know, you're already paying for internet, so you might as well use it. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for sharing that with us, Silvia. I totally agree with that sentiment as well. Now let's move on to the open mic section. This is your opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is yours. Please take it away.
I think that's something I wanted to probably just talk about. I guess it's something that I also do in research, and I guess is gender economics. And I just found that it's kind of interesting as well with this entertainment, because there is so many different things that you can have. So, you know, there is so different cultural aspects about how women spend their time and their money relative to what men do. And yes, I think I was just thinking about, probably there is quite a lot of interest into even the leisures that you have, and a lot of leisures that you have as a woman that you may not think, because, you know, it's a male dominated place, or, you know, like I was saying, like surfing, for instance, and, you know, how women are now like striving a lot into this surfing industry and all these sort of things. So I guess in a way, what I wanted to say in this open mic is that it will be good for us, to women, to also appropriate these sort of leisures that we think are male dominated, or these sort of things that we don't really think that we'd want to do it because there's just so many men or so forth, or this sort of, you know, expenses on things that we don't necessarily think is us, because, you know, like gaming and so forth, it's something like it's more male dominated, but gaming is great, like if you really get into it. So I think I am just kind of using this open mic just as to invite women to get into these different leisures and disrupt the way they think about their leisures and the way they spend the money into this sort of thing. So yeah.
Oh, 100%. I agree with you on that. And the best part about females disrupting male-dominated areas is that we get a lot of very aesthetically pleasing products out of it, and very, what most people would be like, cute, with patterns and prints and all that kind of good stuff. And it, I don't think it even just is beneficial purely for females. It's beneficial for males as well, because you know, you get more options with the products that you in whatever industry, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. It's not factual. Anyway, yeah, thank you very much, Silvia, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with us. I really, really appreciate it. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
There is my website that is bcec.edu.au/ourpeople/Silvia Salazar, or just basically Google Silvia Salazar BCEC, which is where I work. And link me as well. There is thousands of Silvia Salazars, so that is going to be more challenging. But yeah, I think there is in LinkedIn you can find me, Silvia Salazar. It's not it's like Salazar, like Pirates of the Caribbean, so like Salazar, like Harry Potter, I think. So that's kind of think about Salazar in that way.
Yeah, can I just say I love your name, by the way, because it just has such a punch to it, you know. And I love any name that is like a double what do you call it? I don't know what you call it, but you know what I mean, like double of the same letter.
Yeah, I like Salazar. I think it's always the bad guys in all the movies are Salazar. We're never the good guys. It seems like it's something that it's sort of a badass sort of person, I guess. But yeah. So,
but you know what? The bad guys are cooler. So you win some, you lose some. Anyway, thank you very much once again, Silvia, for joining us today. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll catch you in the next episode. You've been listening to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at affluence.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.